Hello and welcome to the Car Care Nut channel. So in today's video, I'm continuing on my series on the 4Runner. We've talked about many of the components of the 4Runner. Today we're going to be focusing on the brake system on the 4Runner. But before we get started, if you're new to the channel, welcome. Consider subscribing to the channel. Check out some of my other videos. If you're a returning subscriber, well, thank you so much for sticking around for this whole series. And without further ado, let's dig right into it. So the brakes on the 4Runner. Now, as a disclaimer, I probably said the word or the numbers 2003 many times in this series, and if you're tired of it, I'm sorry, but we're gonna have to say that a couple more times. Yes, the brake system on the 4Runner is exactly the same from 2003 all the way till today. Not really much have changed, and that's partly why it is so reliable. However, there are a few things that we're gonna address. First, let's talk about other cars other than the 4Runner or your conventional car, like Corolla, Camry, every other Toyota. So they have a brake booster, sits behind the master cylinder. All it does is gives you power assist, so when you put your foot on the brake, not only your foot pressure is applying the brakes, but there is an assist, and that assist typically is done with vacuum, and this vacuum off the running engine stores in the booster, and that's what assists you when you press the brakes. Well, in the 4Runner, that is not the case. They don't have a booster for whatever reason. Maybe they deemed it not strong enough, if you would. They couldn't put one big enough. So it has a hydro assist unit that you can hear in the previous generation. They have some issues, and we're going to address them in this video. But let's talk about how that unit actually works before we move into the other parts of the brakes, which are, for lack of a better word, ancient and very simple. The hydro unit, in addition to the master cylinder or the conventional brake stuff that it normally should have, it has an accumulator and a pump. Now that pump also doubles as the ABS pump, and it's just this giant one unit that houses everything, including the computer for the ABS, traction control, and everything else, called this kit control ECU. Now, when you press your foot on the brake, the master cylinder will be pushed, just like business as usual. However, there is a small accumulator that is charged with hydraulic fluid by the pump, so the pump pressurizes that little accumulator. And when you press the brake, mechanically, it's going to push the master cylinder and open a chamber from that accumulator, and it's going to push fluid to assist in stopping the car. Now that accumulator the pressure inside the accumulator is washed by the computer. When it drops, it's going to pressurize it again and to keep continuous operation. That's why you're going to hear the buzzing all the time. You press the brake, there's a buzz. Sometimes you start the car, you hear the buzz. And then there is one thing that you need to know about these systems. They have a calibration that happens every time you start the truck and start driving. And it's usually you start the truck, everything's quiet, but then as soon as you take off, you'll hear like a grind noise from the brakes, and you can even feel it in the pedal. Folks, that is normal. That is just the system calibrating all the sensors so it knows what's going on as you drive. These systems are typically reliable. They do have one issue we'll talk about in a second, but just know that the whole unit is one complete unit. There is the master cylinder, there is the brake, like the fluid reservoir, there is the accumulator and the pump and the computer. It's all just one giant unit. And you will notice there is one of the hydraulic lines is red. The reason it is red, because that is the charge line, if you would. That line has high pressure, So if you're disconnecting lines with the car running, you got to be careful with that line, because that line carries high pressure at all times, and that's what's going to apply. Now that high pressure comes down every time you shut it off for service, but you got to be careful with that when the car is running. Let's move on to the front brakes, if you would. So 4-piston caliper, things are very simple there. It's been similar, not exactly the same, but similar to the previous generation from 2003-2009. 4-piston caliper, 2 pads, 2 pins that hold them. It's a fixed caliper. The pistons come out and compress the pads, and then it comes back and life is good. Very simple, very down to earth. However, they're notorious for seizing if you live in the Rust Belt. And that problem, again, with the typical theme of the 4Runner, the ancientness of it, was never resolved. It was never addressed. It just stayed the same as the previous generation. There has been one change in actually the 4Runner from this generation, 2010 to 2021, to the previous one. The rotors. The rotors changed. They're slightly bigger. And reliability-wise, other than the seizing if you live in the Rust Belt, they are really reliable, they don't have many issues, and they're sufficient for the truck. However, you live in the Rust Belt, it might be a good idea every year to take them apart, clean everything, because usually the pins seize, and that's what starts the whole seizing process of the caliper. So wouldn't be a bad idea to service them every year, just to clean everything, make sure it's moving smoothly. The rear brakes are also extremely conventional. The one thing about them is, and this has been a carryover of course from the previous generation, exactly the same, single piston caliper, it has slides, it has pins, just good old same brakes from ancient eons ago, if you would. Now, one thing about the rear brakes, it also integrates a parking brake inside the rotor hat. Nothing special about it. Again, 2 cables, you push that pedal on the floor, and the cables pull the parking brake, and it engages the shoes, and that's about that. Really, the brakes in this 4Runner are very, very simplistic. There has been one thing that was significantly improved with this generation 4Runner over the previous generation, and that has to do with the computer in the brake system. I wanted to touch briefly on that so you would know this, because this was a common problem with the previous generation. So every time the battery drops a little low, the computer forgets the calibration for the RH sensor and for the deceleration sensor as well. It just forgets it, and now it throws a code. Every time you hook up a scan tool and leave the key on for a bit, that calibration is gone, you have to redo it, and the typical thing is you'll get a warning light, ABS, traction control, VSC light on, and that was the theme with the previous generation. In this generation, however, they improved that where that is no longer an issue. It would not forget the calibration. Even if you run a low battery, whatever the case may be, it will not forget the calibration, which is a small improvement, and it was actually a surprising one, because largely the system is really unchanged from the previous generation, which is why it is so reliable. And folks, let's talk about the unit itself. I didn't mention this. They are common to have issues. Not with this generation, because this generation is still relatively new, but with the previous generation, since it's the same unit, I'll bring this to your attention so you know. So what happens with these units is they just flat quit, and there's no more brake assist, and they throw all kinds of codes, and they are very expensive. What fails in these units is actually the motor that pressurizes the accumulator. Otherwise, everything else is fine. What happens with the motor is, just like any motor, it has brushes, and it gets filled with debris over time, and then the brushes wear out, and then the motor seizes. So I'm wondering, and I haven't seen this, I'm just wondering if there is ever going to be a DIY kit to take this pump apart, clean it, service it, and that's it, because really that's all that goes wrong with these units. The computer doesn't have problems, the master cylinder doesn't have problems, and the accumulator itself is just a big little tank that stores fluid. Nothing really special about it. Other than that, they really bulletproof. They don't call for a specific brake fluid replacement interval, but You gotta measure the moisture content and replace it as needed. And that's really about it for the brakes. I hope this video was helpful, informative. I know it's a short one, and the brake system in this 4Runner is so ancient. Looks complicated, but it's really ancient and simple in a way. If you like this video, consider giving it a thumbs up. If you're not a subscriber, consider subscribing to the channel. Check out some of my other videos. Until the next video, folks, may the Lord bless you and keep you, and you have a wonderful day.